Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to discuss the Catholic Church's response to the growing Reformation movement sweeping across Europe. So, as you might have guessed, the Catholic Church was not thrilled with all of these different groups breaking away from the Catholicism for a whole bunch of different reasons. And so today is going to be the concerted Catholic response to all of this, what we call the Counter-Reformation. So, here are your objectives for today. By the end of class, hopefully you'll have some sense of these, and then let's dive in. So, the Pope at the time was Pope Paul III, and so he was, as most of the Renaissance popes were, he was not a super active pope, and he did set up some church councils and meetings to look at different types of reform to address some of the problems that Martin Luther and other Reformation reformers had pointed out. So the Catholic Church was clearly aware that there were issues with a lot of the things that were going on, and they were willing to some degree to self-examine and to try to reform and look at these things. The council that was held was the Council of Trent, and it was a whole ecclesiastical meeting of, the College of Cardinals. And in the end, they decided to mostly double down on all their previous ideas. They're going to condemn all Protestant doctrines. They are going to restrict the sale of indulgences and require church leaders to be better moral examples. The whole having affairs and being secretly married thing, probably not ideal. But as far as the actual religious innovations of Martin Luther, they're going to say that the church's interpretation of the Bible is the only interpretation, so no priesthood of all believers, that Catholic tradition was important, that the Bible should be printed only in Latin, so that takes away the whole everyone should be able to read the Bible, and that everyone who questions church theory is going to be labeled a heretic. So what did they actually learn? Not a ton. Here's a decree from the Council of Trent on sacred books. Pretty straightforward. And so all the Latin editions are the only valid version of the Bible. Quote, if it be made out with all of the Latin editions now in circulation of the sacred books are to be held as authentic. Furthermore, in order to restrain petulant spirits, it decrees that no one, relying on their own skill, shall, in matters of faith and in morals pertaining to the understanding of Christian doctrine, presume to interpret the said scriptures contrary to the sense of the Holy Mother Church. So, you can interpret the Bible, but you can only interpret the Bible in exactly the same way that the Catholic Church interprets the Bible. So, sorry Martin Luther, sorry John Calvin, sorry Henry VIII, sorry everybody. None of your interpretations are valid. Only the Pope and the Church's interpretations are valid. But despite the fact that the Council of Trent was disappointingly not addressing a lot of these concerns, there were a number of Catholics who went out and tried to make the church better. Ignatius of Loyola understood that the type of religion that Catholicism was preaching wasn't useful to most people, and so he's going to found his own religious order known as the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuit order. And the goal of the Jesuits is to go out and counter Protestant ideas, counter Protestant arguments, not necessarily just double down on the Pope says it, so it must be so, but actually learn the Bible and then go out with well-reasoned biblical arguments to try to explain it to people, to try to do the type of ministering that the Protestants were now going out and doing the preaching that the Protestants were going out and doing, not just relying on mumbling your way through fake Latin services, but actually explaining to people what the Bible says and why it supports Catholic points of view. This started as a very informal sort of situation, and eventually Ignatius went to visit with Pope Paul, and he gave his blessing to this whole Jesuit thing. And so the Jesuits are going to become another order of the Catholic Church whose goal it is to go out and counter Protestants, bring people back to the church, and eventually they're going to do a bunch of missionary work too. So the Jesuits are going to come back in Unit 3 during the age of exploration and colonization as Europeans travel around the world. Ignatius had a series of laws and rules and spiritual exercises that all Christians should obey. Fun stuff like, quote, we ought to be more prompt and find good and praise as well as constitutions and recommendations as the ways of our superiors. We must, quote, praise positive and scholastic learning, And to be right in everything, we ought to hold that the white which I see is black, if the church so decides it, believing that the church is the ultimate source of authority. So we've got some growth here, but again, it's really tough when your starting principle is that the church is right and the Pope is infallible. There's really only so much wiggle room you can have. So these Jesuits then set out to go preach. They traveled and took confessions, and they did teaching as far as both training new monks and training people within the Catholic tradition, but also just educating lay people on what the church actually says. And so the Jesuits become the foot soldiers of the Catholic Church in going out and trying to counter all of these Reformation ideas. They also go out on missions. Francis Xavier is one of the most famous of these Jesuit missionaries traveling across Asia. We haven't got to the age of exploration yet, but just keep in mind that this happens. And the Jesuits were especially good at this because with their focus on education, they would learn the language, the customs, and the religious traditions of the people that they visited. And then they would use those religious traditions to help teach them about Christianity in terms that they could understand, almost a Buddhist concept of proper learning, sort of orders to expose people to Christian ideas in ways that made sense to them. So here's Francis Xavier's Letters on the Missions, and as he's explaining, they're exploring in China and Japan, trying to further spread Christian ideas. In a lot of places, the Catholic Church allowed or focused on sort of supporting kings in order to keep Catholic control. This was especially important in places like France, where bishops would often also become ministers and work in government, work in an official capacity in government. And so this, quote, union of throne and altar, kings liked it because if they could have church officials as their ministers, it would give them religious power and religious authority as well as their standard kingly authority. And the Catholic Church liked it because if you have, bishops or cardinals advising kings, obviously they're going to be taking confessions from these kings, and the king asks questions like, well, is it sinful to question the will of the Pope? And the cardinals are going to say, of course it is, absolutely, it's 100% sinful, don't question the Pope. And then, and so this union of throne and altar helped keep the Catholic Church entrenched in places like France and Spain, where the monarchies were still dedicated to Catholicism. The Church also developed this system of trials called the Roman Inquisition, where they would send out church officials to go and question people about their heretical practices. They would then have to be called in front of these groups of church officials to defend themselves, and they could be excommunicated or arrested or potentially even killed if they differed too much from traditional church teachings. And so they went out, these priests on mission would go around, hold these trials, and basically force/challenge people to stick to appropriate doctrine. The Spanish also had an Inquisition, and it tended to be somewhat more brutal. When the King and Queen of Spain reconquered the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim forces, they forced Christianization on the population and would often resort to horrific torture in order to get people to confess their sins and to return them sort of to proper Catholic thinking. So the Spanish Inquisition, similar to the Roman Inquisition, except they required less evidence and there was much more horrible torture and breaking of people. Here's an agent of the Spanish Inquisition describing how they learned the names of all the Protestants, and then they would expose them, arrest them, torture them, and make them reconvert to Catholicism or kill them. We also had a number of wars of religion during this time period, specifically the 30 Years' War, which started with the throwing of a church official out of a window, the famous defenestration of Prague, where he survived being thrown out of a third-story window by landing on a pile of horse poop. But this led to some significant conflict and fighting. There's 4 different phases of the 30 Years' War, so we're going to just briefly go through each of the phases. In the first phase, called the Bavarian phase, the Holy Roman Emperor is attempting, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is attempting to re-Catholicize southern Germany. And so he launches attacks on sort of the area in the south here that had become much more Protestant. And there's massive atrocities on both sides, and it's pretty horrific. Catholics kill Protestants, Protestants kill Catholics. Eventually, Denmark jumps in order to help defend them. And they, in the end, there's not a decisive finish here to this early phase. The Holy Roman Emperor is just sort of marching around killing people, and the Danish are trying to stop him. Then the Swedish jump in. The Swedish had embraced Lutheranism, and so they're jumping in on the side of the Protestants. The famous Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus was a genius as far as using artillery, and so he started whipping the Holy Roman Empire repeatedly, and won a series of key battles until, unfortunately, he was killed and the Swedish phase ends. Then France jumps in on the side of the Protestants, which is kind of weird. At this point, it's mostly political. The King of France is looking to weaken the Holy Roman Empire, and so it's less about religion and more about politics. But they fight this brutal stalemate for a few years. And at the end, they sign a treaty called the Peace of Westphalia, which reestablishes the balance of power in Europe. Basically, the Protestant countries of England and Holland are facing off against the Catholic countries of Spain and France. The Holy Roman Empire is going to remain divided, and each German prince is going to be allowed to determine the religion of his little princedom within the Holy Roman Empire. And so there's going to be no religious uniformity within the empire. And this is honestly kind of the beginning of the end of the Holy Roman Empire as a political force. So that's the effect of the 30 Years' War. Here's your final settlement quote. Whatever condition they may be, shall continue to enjoy whatever public or private practice of religion was enjoyed at any time. So we're going to roll back the clock. We're not going to force people to be Catholic, nor are we going to force them to be Protestant. It'll be up to each individual ruler to determine the religion of their kingdom. So that's the Catholic counter-revolution, the counter-reformation, the pushing back against Protestant teachings. In the end, a ridiculous amount of people died, and Europe remains religiously divided, which is going to be a continued source of tension going forward. So, hopefully you can write somewhat detailed responses to these objectives. And this wraps up our unit on European Reformation and Renaissance. Thank you for listening.